I'd gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today.
Remember that catchphrase? It was made famous by a character named Wimpy. He was kind of a vagabond in the old Popeye cartoons, and he was known for always mooching hamburgers on the premise that he would pay for them on Tuesday. But Tuesday never came, and his friends eventually stopped offering him hamburgers. Well, year-end climate talks, or COP24, remain stalled here in Katowice, Poland, in part because Brazil wants to let developing countries keep credit for emission reductions that they sell internationally to meet other countries' climate targets. This is a big deal, and I'll probably do a show on it later. But for now, I'm just offering this Bionic bonus, because the so-called double counting loophole would only apply to the early years of the Paris Agreement, which takes effect in 2020. And proponents of the double counting loophole point out that it includes a caveat that the countries would balance out the double counting at a later date via one of three different options currently in the text. Most countries oppose it because they say it will just lead to imaginary emission reductions at a time when we need them to be real, deep, and verifiable.
Man may be unwittingly changing the world's climate through the waste products of his civilization.
There's a group of us now who are proposing that the Earth has actually entered a new epoch, and that is the Anthropocene.
We know that the enemy is carbon, and we know its ugly face. We should put a big fat price on it, and of course, add to that, drop the subsidies.
This is Steve Zwick with a Bionic bonus coming to you from Katowice, Poland. The proposal that's holding everything up today was submitted by Brazil 3 years ago, shortly after the Paris Climate Agreement was adopted. But it is opposed by the overwhelming majority of countries, this according to several negotiators I talked to who spoke on condition of anonymity. Annie Pestonk, who is the International Council for the Environmental Defense Fund, says the shortfall is unlikely to be balanced and would lead to an imaginary emission reduction while damaging the very countries that its proponents claim it will help. She's the one who likened the proposal to the vagabond character Wimpy in the old Popeye cartoons. He was known for saying, "I'll gladly pay you Tuesday for a hamburger today," she said. But no one did business with him because they knew he wouldn't have the money on Tuesday. Brazil's proposal, she says, is the wimpy one. Now, what is Brazil's argument? The best summary that I've seen is by an environmental economist named Philip Hauser, who wrote about it in a post on his LinkedIn page, and I will provide a link to that in the show notes at bionic-planet.com. You can also Google the title of the article. It's called Dealing with Corresponding Adjustments under Article 6.4 of the Paris Agreement. In a nutshell, here is the argument. He points out that many developing countries reduced emissions under the Kyoto Protocol, which is the precursor to the Paris Agreement, and they did so partly in the hope of generating offsets that they could sell into the Kyoto Protocol's clean development mechanisms. Countries that generate offsets, he says, were left in the lurch by the developed world's failure to set a binding global cap, and they are now holding large inventories of unsold offsets. Under the Paris Agreement, a new kind of offset called an Internationally Transferred Mitigation Outcome, or ITMO, can be sold to other countries, either bilaterally or through a global mechanism called the Sustainable Development Mechanism. In either case, the buying country also takes ownership of the emission reduction, which means the country that reduced the emissions and then sold the offset, that country can no longer count that reduction against its own greenhouse gas emissions. It sold the emission reduction, doesn't have it anymore. So even if you reduce the emissions inside, say, Brazil, by saving a patch of forest or planting a bunch of trees, even if you did that inside Brazil, if you sell the emission reduction to another country, the other country gets credit for the emission reduction. Brazil does not. Now, since the adoption of the Paris Agreement, Brazil has argued that developing countries should be granted a grace period during which they can sell offsets internationally but still claim credit for the reduced emissions in their own inventories, provided they then make the so-called corresponding adjustments at a later date. corresponding adjustments are essentially adjusting your emission inventories accordingly. So they have to adjust it later on. Now, the Brazilian proposal would, in other words, allow developing countries to count their emission reductions twice at first, provided they agree to make good on the emission debt later. Now, when is later? Well, normally they talk about the year 2030 or 2031, and the overwhelming majority of countries are leery of the proposal, which they say will lead to a decade of imaginary emission reductions at a time when we need to be driving emissions deeper. So, how long will this standoff continue? Nobody knows. But here's the interesting thing. Several observers, speaking off the record, have told me that a compromise date of 2023 would not be surprising. So that's something we might see coming out of this. Meanwhile, there's another proposal, also spearheaded by Brazil, that would allow countries holding CDM credits to sell them to airlines under a program called CORSIA, which we covered in episode 8 of the Bionic Planet podcast. CORSIA stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, and it starts in 2021. So, just to summarize, with this second proposal, Brazil is now saying that because CORSIA is not part of the Paris Agreement, they should still be able to get credit by selling old, unused CDM offsets into the program. Why is that a problem? Well, in part because it opens up another double counting loophole, or could. Also because the CDM was a pilot program. They tested a lot of new methods, and they didn't all work, which means a lot of these CDM offsets are considered environmentally dubious. And here's another quote from Annie Pestonk. This is from a blog piece that she wrote. Dumping bogus credits into CORSIA and giving special treatment to emission reductions that originate from outside NDCs. NDCs, you may recall, means nationally determined contributions. It's a country's climate action plan. Emission reductions that originate from outside NDCs and are used in CORSIA would punch a big hole in the climate benefit of the aviation agreement and a big hole in the climate credibility of ICAO, which is the International Civil Aviation Organization, and the airlines. It would undercut the Paris parties' efforts to limit the global temperature increase to well below 2 degrees. Anyway, be sure to follow the latest developments on Ecosystem Marketplace. That's ecosystemmarketplace.com. We'll be tracking this as this story develops, as well as other elements of the effort to create a Paris rulebook here at Year-End Climate Talks in Katowice, Poland. Till later, I'm Steve Zwick in Katowice. Thanks for listening.